a few days, I started a post, and it's probably the first of three on what I call the known and the unknown. And I called that first post, "The Great Mystery is Not Meant to be Solved." This second post on the known and unknown is about shrinking self-importance. I've mentioned Carlos Castaneda several times, and in his series of books, about 10 of which I read decades ago, his teacher, Don Juan, always says to him, "Reduce your self-importance." In reading those books, I must have read that line, "Shrink your self-importance, reduce your self-importance," at least 100 times. So I want to talk about that, self-importance. So I'll start by saying that the culture we live in, our modern culture and the politics we live in, it's based mostly on self-interest. And the values of psychology are ego-oriented. They emphasize self-knowledge, increasing self-esteem, and getting what we want. Yet at the core, these notions of self make up a large part of the current problem and problems that we're engaged with. There's an old Buddhist notion that states that a primary cause of unhappiness is spending most of our attention and energy thinking about ourselves, when that self simply doesn't exist. The self we have adopted, the separate self, the ego, is a noun, and it refers to the perceiver, the observer and judge at the center of the known. But this self is an abstract notion. It's a linguistic invention, a supposedly autonomous entity that it requires and assumes a point of view outside and detached from the flow of existence, a point of view that has no actual reality. Years ago, someone gave me an example of this. He said, imagine the Big Bang, and I did. And he said, virtually everyone imagines the Big Bang as if they're sitting far away, and somewhere in a little speck in the dark horizon, there's an enormous flash, and then things start moving towards you. But he said, this is totally false, because before the Big Bang, there was no space. So this idea that you are sitting back and observing the beginning of existence means that point of view is not in the actual existence that was there at the time. So, the great question, who am I? Am I a noun? Or am I really more like a verb? In the world of language, I is a noun, and nouns as things imply separate objects and assume disconnection. Language divides the unified field of experience. It can create polarities, up, down, left, right, good, bad. These distinctions may appear as opposites, but no part of a polarity can exist without the other. Left has no meaning without right. Inner has relevance only in relationship to outer, and up makes sense only when associated with down. There is no meaning to left, east, right, or down in isolation. This also holds true for the word self. This too is part of a polarity, paired and related to whatever is defined as outer or beyond the self. Self is meaningful only in its relationship to world or other. Any attempt to know the self as autonomous or independent, as distinct from its myriad and changing relationships to that world, is an impossibility. Yet, conditioned by our language structure, we pursue self-knowledge or self-esteem as if this self were a separate entity, an actual fact. And this tendency becomes a constant source of loneliness, disconnection, and disorientation. For us to stretch toward that vast and magical unknown, we have to move beyond this self. Castaneda's teacher, Don Juan, exhorting him constantly to shrink his self-importance, reminds him again and again that the I is not the center of the world. And when this self shrinks and is removed from the center, the world around it expands correspondingly, and feelings of wonder, magic, and magnificence develop and flower. Throughout human history, the methods of all mystical and spiritual traditions have involved forms and techniques to break the obsession and constant self-referencing of the I and open to the other, that vast and unknown realm beyond the self's confines. The practices and the avenues to move beyond the self can be many and varied. Some involve expressions of surrender, praise, gratitude, or prayer. An energetic offering in which we speak from the self, the known, but what we are intending and speaking to lies beyond that known, the unknown. Other forms use the physical sensory world, ordeals, fasting, breath, yoga, sound, or they evoke the emotions through fear, love, compassion, devotion, or ecstatic dance. Some address the mind, usually in some form of quieting it, as in meditation, or some nurture the imaginative, visionary realm through dreams, art, poetry, shamanic trance, and the use of plant allies. Of course, these practices can range from austere to elaborate, from easy to difficult, from vision quests and initiatory rites to the simple expression of gratitude. But at their core, they share one thing in common: a shrinking or removal of attention and energy from the self in its ordinary and consensual reality, and a corresponding emphasis on all that lies beyond, that changing, fluid, magical, and mysterious world of the unknown, and the profusion of possibilities to perceive and engage with it. Let's do it. Oh, be well.